Late July 1944. The hedgerows of Normandy are still wet from morning mist and cordite smoke. Broken branches hang low over churned earth. The smell of damp soil mixes with burned fuel. A German infantryman watches from a shallow foxhole as the American line ahead of him shifts again. Yesterday, that same stretch of ground had been torn apart by artillery. He had seen bodies carried back. He had counted the gaps. By any measure he understands, the unit across from him should be crippled. But this morning, the line is full. New helmets catch the light. Fresh faces move with unfamiliar caution. Trucks idle behind the trees, unloading crates. Rifles are passed forward. Orders move calmly down the ranks. To the German soldiers, this is not bravery. It is something stranger. They had learned to measure an enemy by losses. A regiment shattered took weeks to recover. Sometimes it never did. That was how war worked. That was how Germany now fought, stretching thinner every month. Yet the Americans return as if nothing had happened. The same unit, the same numbers, only different men. And in that quiet realization, as the line settles back into place, a troubling question takes shape. Where are they all coming from? By the summer of 1944, the war had entered a phase that Germany had long feared but could no longer avoid. The conflict was no longer about bold maneuvers or sudden victories. It had become a war of endurance, of manpower, factories, and time. On the Eastern Front, the German army had already been bled white. Stalingrad, concluded in February 1943, had destroyed an entire field army. Kursk, that summer, had drained Germany of its last strategic reserves. From that point forward, German units fought defensively, absorbing losses they could no longer fully replace. Entire divisions existed on paper, but lacked trained men. Veterans were irreplaceable. New recruits arrived younger, less prepared, and fewer in number. The Western Front had been quiet for years, but it was never ignored. German planners knew that when the Allies returned to France, they would return with overwhelming force. Yet, even with that knowledge, Germany could not create the manpower needed to face both fronts equally. Choices were made. The East demanded priority. The West would be held as long as possible. By 1944, those compromises were visible everywhere. Infantry divisions were reorganized again and again. The creation of Volksgrenadier units reflected necessity, not innovation. Formations built will reduce strength, mix experience levels, and shorten training cycles. Artillery units were consolidated. Support troops were pushed into frontline roles. Recovery time for shattered units shrank from weeks to days, sometimes hours. German soldiers felt this change directly. Where once replacements arrived in cohesive drafts, trained together and assigned as groups, they now came in fragments. Individuals or pairs joined depleted companies with little preparation. Familiar faces disappeared faster than they could be replaced. Commanders learned to fight with what they had, not what doctrine demanded. At the same time, the Allied bombing campaign tightened its grip. Rail yards, fuel depots, and factories across Germany were hit repeatedly. Production continued, but at growing cost. Even when weapons existed, transporting them became a gamble. Fuel shortages limited training. Aircraft were grounded for lack of pilots more often than lack of planes. This was the reality German soldiers carried with them into the summer of 1944. They expected heavy fighting in France. They expected losses. What they did not expect was an enemy whose losses seemed to vanish almost as quickly as they appeared. Because while Germany was struggling to hold its armies together, the United States had been preparing for a very different kind of war, one planned years in advance, far from any battlefield. The contrast between these two systems would soon become impossible to ignore. While German divisions fought to preserve their remaining strength, the United States was fighting a different battle, one that began long before American soldiers ever set foot in France. It was a battle of preparation, scale, and organization, waged in training camps, factories, rail yards, and ports thousands of miles from the front. After entering the war in December 1941, the United States did not rush blindly into combat. Instead, it expanded deliberately. The selective service system had already been in place since 1940, allowing the Army to grow methodically rather than reactively. By 1943, millions of men were in uniform, cycling through a vast network of training centers designed not only to create units, but to sustain them over time. Central to this system was a doctrine Germany never fully embraced: individual replacement. Rather than keeping soldiers together from training through combat, the U.S. Army treated manpower as a flowing resource. Men were trained, classified, and held in replacement pools until needed. When losses occurred at the front, new soldiers were sent forward to fill specific roles: riflemen, medics, drivers, gunners, often within days. This approach was not sentimental. It was mathematical. American planners assumed heavy casualties long before the first landing craft hit Normandy. They studied the attrition rates of the First World War and adjusted upward. Units were expected to lose men continuously. The system was designed to absorb that loss without collapsing operational tempo. Behind this doctrine stood American industry. By 1944, the United States was producing weapons and equipment on a scale unmatched in history. Rifles, machine guns, radios, uniforms, boots, and vehicles flowed in quantities that allowed replacement soldiers to arrive fully equipped, not scavenging from the fallen. Entire divisions in training could be held in reserve while others fought, ensuring that manpower never ran dry. Logistics made the difference visible at the front. Ports in England became staging grounds for an uninterrupted stream of men and material. Ships crossed the Atlantic on tight schedules, protected by convoy systems that had largely defeated the U-boat threat. Once in Europe, rail networks and truck companies moved replacements inland with relentless efficiency. For American soldiers, the system felt impersonal. Men joined units they did not know, under officers they had never met. But for commanders, it meant something vital. Shattered companies could be rebuilt without withdrawing from the line. German intelligence noticed quickly. Reports from Normandy spoke of American units returning to strength after engagements that should have rendered them ineffective. Prisoner interrogations mentioned fresh troops arriving at night. Observers noted new faces, clean uniforms, and intact formations appearing where losses had been severe. To German soldiers accustomed to conserving manpower, this was deeply unsettling. They were trained to believe that inflicting casualties weakened an enemy. Against Americans, that logic seemed to fail. And as the fighting intensified across France, this unseen system, quiet, distant, and vast, began to exert its full weight on the battlefield. Angle 1, the human view from the German line. 4 German soldiers on the Western Front. War had always been measured in faces. Familiar men beside them in the trench. Veterans whose reactions needed no explanation. When those faces disappeared, the loss was more than numerical. It was personal, and it weakened the unit in ways no report could capture. In Normandy, that understanding began to fail. German infantrymen noticed that American units they had fought days earlier appeared whole again almost immediately. The same insignia, the same regimental markings, but not the same men. Fresh soldiers moved cautiously, their movements careful, their reactions slower. Veterans recognized this instantly. These were replacements. Normally, this was a sign of vulnerability. In German experience, new men meant inexperience, hesitation, mistakes. Yet the expected opportunity rarely came. The Americans did not retreat to rebuild. They stayed in place. Their artillery remained active. Their patrols continued. Their positions held. Letters and diaries from German soldiers reveal confusion more than fear. They wrote of endless Americans and new men every day. Losses that should have forced withdrawal did not. Instead, the line remained steady, reinforced quietly after dark. This altered how German soldiers perceived time. A successful attack no longer promised relief. Even a costly engagement achieved little if the enemy returned before the next morning. Attrition, once Germany's strength, was becoming meaningless, and that realization weighed heavily on morale. Because if casualties no longer mattered, then endurance alone would not decide the battle. Angle 2, logistics as a weapon. What German soldiers could see was only the surface. Behind the American front lay a system so vast it was almost invisible from the line. By late summer 1944, U.S. logistics in France operated at a scale Germany could not match. Thousands of trucks moved day and night, carrying fuel, ammunition, rations, and men. Replacement depots were established near the front, holding trained soldiers ready to move forward at short notice. The Red Ball Express became the most visible symbol of this effort. Though famous for fuel delivery, it also supported the movement of personnel. Roads were prioritized for American traffic. Bridges were repaired within hours. Bottlenecks were bypassed rather than endured. German logistics, by contrast, were shrinking. Fuel shortages limited vehicle use. Rail lines were disrupted by air attacks. Replacements moved slowly, often on foot, and arrived exhausted before reaching the line. American commanders could plan with confidence. Losses were expected, but they were not paralyzing. Units were reinforced without leaving position. Companies were formed around surviving non-commissioned officers. The front stayed intact. For German observers, this consistency was alarming. It suggested not improvisation, but design, not luck, but system. And behind that system stood an industrial power still untouched by war. Angle 3. Industrial depth and the meaning of replacement. Every replacement soldier represented more than a body. He represented a rifle already manufactured, boots already issued, ammunition already stockpiled, and transport already allocated. By 1944, American factories were producing more than enough to equip both new units and replacements simultaneously. There was no need to strip one formation to sustain another. Losses at the front did not compete with training at home. German industry, under constant bombardment, operated under triage. Equipment was repaired rather than replaced. Older weapons were pressed back into service. Shortages became routine. This difference shaped battlefield reality. American replacements arrived with full kits. They did not inherit worn weapons or incomplete gear. Their presence did not weaken other units elsewhere. To German soldiers, this suggested something deeply troubling. The enemy was not merely replacing men. He was replacing strength. And as the fighting dragged on, it became clear that this was not a temporary advantage, but a permanent one. The question now was how the system would hold under its greatest test yet. Angle 4. Leadership and the American philosophy of attrition. At the highest levels of American command, the replacement system was not an accident of abundance. It was a deliberate choice shaped by painful lessons from the past. General George C. Marshall, U.S. Army Chief of Staff, believed that wars were not won by preserving elite formations, but by sustaining pressure until the enemy broke. The American Army would not gamble everything on a few irreplaceable units. Instead, it would maintain continuous combat power across the entire front. This philosophy shaped how the U.S. Army accepted casualties. Losses were tragic, but they were anticipated. American leaders planned not to avoid attrition, but to survive it better than the enemy. The replacement system ensured that no single engagement, however costly, could cripple the Army as a whole. In contrast, German doctrine placed enormous value on unit cohesion and veteran corps. Divisions were expected to fight as integrated organisms. Once that cohesion was lost, effectiveness collapsed. By 1944, Germany no longer had the luxury of rebuilding units properly, yet its command culture still depended on that model. American leadership made a colder calculation. Units would change faces constantly, but they would not stop moving. Officers and non-commissioned officers became the backbone of continuity. As long as leadership remained, the unit remained functional. German commanders began to recognize this difference. Reports from the front noted that American formations did not weaken after heavy losses in the expected way. They bent, absorbed, and continued. It was not brilliance in a single battle that unnerved them. It was consistency. Angle 5. Enemy intelligence and growing alarm. German intelligence officers studied the Western Front carefully. Prisoners were questioned. Supply routes were observed. Patterns were recorded. What they saw disturbed them. American units showed no long-term degradation. Divisions that had taken severe casualties in Normandy appeared fully operational weeks later, sometimes days. Replacement flow seemed uninterrupted by weather, terrain, or German counterattacks. Captured documents and prisoner testimony pointed to organized replacement depots, standardized training, and massive reserves waiting in England. The scale was beyond anything Germany could replicate at that stage of the war. One recurring observation appeared in multiple reports. American losses did not reduce American presence. Instead, they seemed to trigger reinforcement. This inverted the logic of warfare German officers had known. Attrition, once a tool to weaken an enemy, now worked against them. Every engagement cost Germany men it could not replace, while America absorbed losses and returned stronger. By late 1944, some German analysts openly questioned whether defeating such a system was even possible. Angle 6, the psychological weight on German soldiers. For the men in the trenches, the effect was deeply personal. German soldiers expected exhaustion to take its toll on both sides. They expected time to be an ally. Instead, time became an enemy. Each day of fighting reduced their own strength permanently, while the American line renewed itself. This realization eroded confidence. Victory no longer seemed tied to skill or courage alone. It depended on something abstract and unreachable. Factories, ships, training camps thousands of kilometers away. Veterans felt the shift most acutely. They understood what replacement shortages meant. They knew when a unit was being hollowed out. Seeing the Americans avoid that fate created a sense of inevitability. The war no longer felt winnable. It felt unwinnable by design. And as autumn turned to winter, that design would be tested under the most desperate gamble Germany had left. One final offensive meant to break the American system itself. By the autumn of 1944, the American replacement system had already been strained to its limits. The fighting in Normandy had been relentless. The hedgerows consumed men at a rate few planners had predicted. Entire companies were reduced to fractions of their original strength. Yet even under that pressure, the system held. Now the war shifted eastward. As U.S. forces pushed toward Germany, they entered terrain that favored defense. The Hürtgen forest was dark, wet, and unforgiving. Visibility was measured in meters. Artillery burst shattered trees into lethal splinters. Mines and booby traps slowed every advance. Casualties mounted daily. American units suffered heavily. Rifle platoons were worn down again and again. But instead of pulling divisions out of line, replacements flowed forward. Men arrived in cold rain, often moving directly from depots into combat positions. They filled empty foxholes beside strangers whose names they barely knew. German defenders expected this environment to grind the Americans down. It had done so to others before. Forest fighting punished inexperience. But once again, the anticipated collapse never came. U.S. units thinned, then thickened. The line bent, but it did not break. By November, German intelligence noted something unsettling. American formations in Hürtgen had absorbed losses comparable to those suffered in Normandy, and yet they remained operational. This was not recklessness. It was capacity. Then, in December 1944, Germany launched its final gamble. The Ardennes offensive, planned in secrecy and desperation, was designed to rupture the American front, encircle weakened units, and exploit what German commanders believed to be a fragile replacement system stretched too far. Initial success fed that belief. American lines were penetrated. Units were cut off. Losses were heavy. Roads clogged with refugees and retreating troops. For a brief moment, German soldiers thought they had found a breaking point. But behind the shattered front, the American system was already moving. Replacement depots emptied. Training units were stripped. Men originally bound for other theaters were rerouted. Trucks rolled through snow and darkness, delivering fresh soldiers into chaos. What the Germans did not yet realize was that this offensive, intended to exhaust American manpower, would instead reveal just how deep those reserves truly were. As the Ardennes offensive expanded, German forces pressed forward with urgency. Every hour mattered. Fuel was scarce. Weather closed in. Commanders understood that surprise alone would not win a battle. They needed the Americans' collapse before replacements could arrive. That collapse never came. Despite the confusion of the initial assault, American command reacted with speed. Communications were disrupted, but not destroyed. Units were cut off, but not abandoned. Most importantly, the flow of men did not stop. Replacement soldiers were rushed forward under conditions few armies could have endured. Some arrived without winter clothing. Others were issued rifles only hours before entering combat. They came from training camps, anti-aircraft units, and rear area assignments. Their origins varied, but their purpose was the same: to restore the line. German soldiers advancing through the Ardennes began to encounter resistance where they expected none. Positions thought cleared were suddenly reoccupied. Units believed shattered reappeared, reinforced, and fighting again. The American front stabilized faster than German planners had believed possible. Nowhere was this more visible than around Bastogne. Encircled units held their ground not because they were untouched, but because they were sustained. Supplies were delivered by air. Men were redistributed under fire. Losses were replaced as quickly as roads and skies allowed. For German troops, the psychological impact was devastating. The offensive demanded speed, yet every American position seemed to regenerate. Each delay cost fuel and momentum. Every attack drained German manpower that could not be replaced. By late December, the realization set in. The Ardennes had not exposed a weakness. It had exposed a certainty. American losses did not create gaps. They triggered reinforcement. The deeper the Germans pushed, the stronger the resistance became. When the weather cleared and Allied air power returned, the outcome was sealed. The offensive stalled. German units, exhausted and under strength, began to withdraw. The turning point was no longer in doubt. The question was no longer whether the Americans could replace their losses, but whether Germany could survive a war fought on those terms. And as the front rolled east once more, the answer became increasingly clear. When the Ardennes fighting ended in January 1945, the landscape told a stark story. Burned villages, frozen forests, wrecked armor, and thousands of casualties marked Germany's final attempt to reverse the war in the West. But beneath the visible destruction lay a quieter outcome, one that mattered far more in the long run. Germany had spent its last strategic reserves. The Ardennes offensive cost the Wehrmacht tens of thousands of irreplaceable soldiers. Veteran units were shattered. Panzer divisions that had once formed the backbone of German operational power were reduced to fragments. Equipment losses could no longer be repaired or replaced at meaningful scale. Fuel shortages crippled mobility even where vehicles survived. For American forces, the cost was also severe. Casualty figures were high. Units were strained, but the system absorbed the blow. Replacement pipelines continued to function through winter conditions that should have paralyzed them. Training centers in the United States adjusted output. Men originally assigned to other duties were reclassified and sent forward. By February, many American units involved in the Ardennes were again near authorized strength. German prisoners taken during a retreat spoke openly about what they had seen. They described attacking positions only to find new defenders days later. They expressed disbelief at how quickly American formations recovered. For some, this realization came before surrender. For others, it settled in afterward. Commanders on the German side now faced an impossible reality. There was no longer a meaningful way to wear the Americans down. Each battle only accelerated Germany's own collapse. Time, which had once been a strategic factor, now worked entirely against them. As Allied forces crossed the Rhine and entered Germany itself, the contrast became even sharper. American units advanced with steady pressure, rarely pausing to rebuild. German resistance stiffened in places, but it lacked depth. Losses could not be absorbed. Every engagement weakened the defense permanently. The war in the West had entered its final phase, not through sudden defeat, but through irreversible imbalance. And as American columns rolled deeper into Germany, the consequences of that imbalance became visible to civilians and soldiers alike. By the spring of 1945, the disparity in manpower had become undeniable across the collapsing German front. American units advanced town by town, river by river, rarely stopping long enough for the enemy to reorganize. Even when resistance stiffened, it was thin and uneven, signs of an army that no longer possessed depth. German commanders attempted last-minute reorganizations. Remnants of shattered divisions were merged. Training units, sailors, and Air Force personnel were pressed into infantry roles. Boys and old men filled the ranks of hastily assembled formations. These were not measures of strategy. They were measures of survival. American forces, by contrast, continue to operate with predictability. Losses occurred daily, but the front did not hollow out. Replacement soldiers arrived with equipment, rations, and assignments already planned. Officers redistributed men to preserve unit function. The machine continued to move forward. Captured German officers later reflected on this imbalance with remarkable clarity. In post-war interrogations and memoirs, many acknowledged that once the Americans landed in force, defeat became a matter of time, not because American soldiers were invincible, but because American systems were. Cities like Cologne, Frankfurt, and Nuremberg fell not through sudden collapse, but through sustained pressure. German resistance often fought hard in isolated pockets, yet lacked the ability to recover afterward. Once a line broke, there was nothing behind it. For German civilians, the shock extended beyond the battlefield. They saw American units advance despite visible casualties. They noticed how quickly formations reappeared after heavy fighting. The war they had been told would exhaust the enemy instead revealed Germany's own exhaustion. By April, the Western Front no longer functioned as a continuous defense. It existed as scattered resistance. Surrenders increased. Units dissolved. Orders lost meaning. When Germany capitulated in May 1945, the outcome was not surprising to those who had watched the war unfold from the trenches. The decisive factor had revealed itself long before the final surrender. It was not a single battle or a single commander. It was the ability to replace loss with strength, and to do so without pause. The story of American replacements during the final year of World War II is not one of heroism alone, nor of individual battlefield brilliance. It is a story of system scale and foresight. German soldiers were shocked not because the Americans fought harder, but because the Americans could endure loss without hesitation, because their war machine extended far beyond the line of sight. This ability to absorb attrition reshaped combat itself. Where German doctrine relied on cohesion, experience, and preservation, the United States relied on preparation, planning, and industrial depth. The contrast revealed a fundamental truth about modern warfare. Battles are not won solely by courage, but by the structures that sustain that courage under fire. For the men in the trenches, this was a quiet horror. They could see the effect, but not the machinery behind it. Every fresh soldier, every restored company, every unit that reappeared after loss reminded them that their own efforts, however brave, could not halt the tide. The replacement system also demonstrated the human dimension of war at scale. Soldiers arriving from thousands of miles away carried the weight of factories, logistics, and strategic planning with them. The war became a reflection of the nation itself, resilient, adaptable, and vast. By the time Germany surrendered, the lesson was unmistakable. Victory was not only a matter of tactics or valor. It was a measure of endurance, replenishment, and the unseen infrastructure that made frontline courage possible. And for those German soldiers who had watched in disbelief as units they had shattered returned to fight again, the memory lingered long after the guns fell silent. In modern war, the strength of an army is measured not only by what it loses, but by how quickly it can rise again.